All right, well, let's kick things off. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Smart Building Exchange panel discussion session on indoor environmental quality. I'm Chris Meek with the University of Washington Department of Architecture here in Seattle, where I direct the Integrated Design Lab. We provide interlinked research, technical assistance, and education focused on delivering high-performance, energy-efficient, and low-carbon buildings. In 2020, the COVID pandemic shined a bright light on the importance of healthy indoor environments, especially creating and maintaining indoor air quality. However, this is not a new concern. Research and practice over the past 40 plus years has presented an increasingly robust case for the value of high quality indoor environments, which include everything from clean air, daylight, acoustics, views to the exterior, light and temperature variation, and biophilia. The return on investment of indoor health and comfort conditions has been expressed in terms of employee recruitment, retention, productivity, and many other metrics. This session will focus on three broad areas of discussion. What are the largest indoor air quality challenges for occupant health in buildings? What are some of the solution sets and research results that are emerging to help building owners and users improve occupant health? And what are new indoor air quality standards and the trend toward performance monitoring, especially in the context of climate effects such as wildfire smoke? Our format today will include short presentations from each of our panelists, and we will follow that with a moderated panel discussion. If any of you have questions you would like to submit to our panelists, please use the conference Q&A function. With that, I'd like to introduce our three distinguished panelists, Professor Vivian Loftness, Dr. Stephanie Taylor, and Dr. Seema Bhangar. Professor Vivian Loftness is Paul Mellon Chair and University Professor at Carnegie Mellon University and former head of the Carnegie Mellon School of Architecture. She's an internationally renowned researcher, author, and educator with over 40 years of experience in building science research for industry and government. She has authored numerous publications on climate and regionalism in architecture and design for performance in the workplace of the future to enhance productivity, health, and the triple bottom line. Dr. Seema Bhangar serves as principal of the Healthy Buildings and Communities for Innovation and Research at the U.S. Green Building Council. She previously held program manager and technical lead roles at the commercial real estate firm WeWork and an environmental sensing technology startup, Aclima. She serves on a National Academy's expert committee and on the board of the independent nonprofit, the Indoor Air Institute. And lastly, Dr. Stephanie Taylor received her MD from Harvard Medical School in Boston, Massachusetts, followed by clinical practice in pediatric oncology, as well as receiving a master's degree in architecture and several years working in a healthcare architecture firm. Dr. Taylor's company, Building for Health, founded in 2020, has created a sensor suite, analytical platform, and occupant dashboard, which makes visible the complex relationship between the indoor environment and human health, thus allowing a determination of whether indoor ecosystem has a positive or negative impact on inhabitants. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Taylor, who's going to kick off our presentation.
Thank you, Chris. It's good to hear what I'm doing in my life. Let's see. So, I decided when I was preparing my slides that I'll go over the next 10 or 12 minutes. I may as well just put it right out there how important I feel managing our environment is. I actually think that until we get this right, until we learn to manage indoor air, our indoor environment, where I hate to say it because you've probably heard it way too many times, we spend 90% of our time, but until we really begin to understand and manage the relationship between the indoor environment and our health, and how management of that indoor environment for our health impacts the outdoor environment, we're kind of boxed into a corner, and we're seeing evidence of the harm from being boxed into the corner as I perceive it. I really honestly think that if we get this straight, it'll be the best thing we do in this century. So I do a lot of stuff. I'm a physician. I work with Harvard Med School. I have Building for Health. I work with ASHRAE a lot, and I'm really honored to be on a volunteer for the Green Building Council. So in the next, again, 10 minutes now, I want to talk about 4 things. One is a problem, how we are under attack from both within our bodies and from outside of our bodies due to, as I see it, the compartmentalization and the silos we've created. That's the problem. The opportunity is, how do we manage where we are? And so how do we actually visualize and manage our environment from a health perspective to reverse the problems caused by compartmentalization? Thirdly, how do we do this? How do we actually quantify the impact of the indoor environment on human health? Not only from the perspective of risk and exposure, things that the Wells-Riley equation addresses, but how do we quantify the impact of the indoor environment on our immune system, on our metabolism, on our cognition? So they're kind of 2 different parts to how we relate to our environment. There's what is out there to attack us, if not that to sound paranoid, but also how does the indoor environment affect our ability to defend ourselves? And fourthly, I finally learned in my 60s that unless we can create a business case for new behaviors or for change, it won't happen. So how do we create a business case for improving our health? So first, I just wanted to start really broad, like, what are we as human beings? What are we made of? It ends up we're basically stardust. So all the elements that are in stardust, plus some initial energy that created amino acids, energy probably came from the sun. Those are our components. But so if you put all of these elements together and looking at how much is in our body, we're worth about $1.99 at your local hobby store. Clearly, there's more to us than that. We're worth more than that, but we're very much related to the universe. So this is in talking about decreasing silos. But there's more to us. We learned when the human genome was sequenced that about 60% of our cells, by cell number, are actually microbes. So when we think about the indoor environment, we think about sanitation, when we think about cleaning the air, surface disinfection, let's remember that often what we're doing are removing the microbes that help us, because it's really the diversity of these microbes, which we call our microbiome, or the microbiome of the building. It's the diversity of these bacterial, viral, and fungal communities that determine pretty much every aspect of our health, from autoimmune disorders to heart attacks, to things that you would never, or at least I didn't understand were related to microbes, things like obesity, anxiety, your vulnerability to Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. So you might be thinking, okay, that's interesting, but what does it have to do with the indoor environment? Well, it ends up that indoor air management and the surfaces that we select in building design actually determine indoor microbiomes, which in turn affect our microbiome. So we want to be managing our environments to select for the helpful microbes, not for the pathogens. So what's the opportunity that we can achieve? What can be the success if we reverse some of these silos, the silos between microbes and humans? It's not us versus them. The silo between the indoor environment as it's evaluated for energy, for aesthetics, and the occupant health. How do we unite those silos? How do we unite what's going on outside of our buildings with what's going on inside of our buildings? Because my premise is that this compartmentalization is a huge driving force behind the struggles that we're having right now. Building management, architects, engineers have their own set of concerns, conserving energy, avoiding structural disasters in a flood or earthquake, following building codes, especially after COVID-19, disinfecting as thoroughly as possible. Medicine's over here, we follow clinical protocols. Medicine's in the business of sickness. Medicine does not value prevention nearly enough. And we hope not to get sued. But I believe that we need to unite these areas and make human health and managing our indoor environment for human health the absolute North Star of our buildings. So how do we do that? So here, if you think about how do we monitor buildings right now? What is our focus often? It's optimizing energy. So the factors that are monitored are particle, gas concentrations, temperature, hopefully humidity is managed in a good way, room air changes and pressurization. But if we're really going to start factoring in the human being, we need to start thinking about what is indoor air quality doing to our physiology? What is indoor air quality doing to the microbes in our space and in our bodies? And I just added this about 10 minutes ago, because I want to make sure that you understand, I'm not just talking about indoor air quality and the risks that this might present, such as the presence of viruses or bacteria in the air. But I'm also talking about how the indoor environment affects our physiological defense mechanisms. Because the top part, how indoor air quality affects our defenses, is often not considered when we think about managing buildings for health. So how can we do this? And what have I been doing in the last couple of years to accomplish these goals of decompartmentalizing? So I want to talk to you for a minute about using a real-time indoor air quality tool that's based on studies in toxicology, epidemiology, cell biology, medicine, and really, at least for myself, about 30 years of experience, bringing these database foundations together to manage the health impact of the indoor environment. So what's that look like? So what this looks like from my perspective is first identifying the metrics that you see listed on the left that we know impact human health, not only individually, but how these components interact with each other to either have an additive or a synergistic effect, primarily a harmful effect, unless you're thinking of it the other way around. But how do these compounds, both individually and together, impact our bodies? What we've been doing is quantifying the impact on your immune system, your cognitive functioning, your neuroendocrine functioning, your metabolism, so that means your liver, your pancreas, and how these indoor components impact the microbiome and your risk of getting an infection. We put all of those quantifications into one score for the person who doesn't want to be bombarded by data. If you're above 50, you're in good shape. If you're below 50, you need to do something. And concurrently, you can dive back into the granular data if you want to see what's driving your score. So what this looks like out in the real world, we put sensors indoors. We had sensors manufactured to capture the data that we need. We have an outdoor sensor. We calculate a health score based on the process I just told you about. We report that to the building owner, to the manager, or whomever the customer feels it's appropriate to see the data. And then we recommend remediation. So right now, we haven't automated our remediation steps, but we hope to. But let's talk for a second about understanding what's going on outdoors. So right now, with ASHRAE, the 241, there's a protocol for running your HVAC equipment, ventilation, filtration, or effective air changes according to an indoor threat. And now actually we're working on the guidelines 44P, which is going to address building management when there's an outdoor pollute event. But so what we do is we monitor simultaneously both indoors and outdoors. So you can see what your air quality is outdoors, and that will feed into the equation of what you're going to do indoors. Do you want to just bring in a lot of outdoor air that's unconditioned? Do you want to, for a short period of time, recirculate and filter? or, other strategies for improving your indoor air quality. But I think it's really important to understand what's going on outdoors as well as indoors. This is just a graph that I'm not going to go through in the interest of time, but it shows you that the purple are the outdoor health scores. So you can see when the outdoor health score is low, let me move this thing. Most of the time the indoor spaces are better. So that's good. There's some sort of filtration or something that's preventing outdoor contaminants from coming indoors. But you can see in different rooms, you have a different degree of protection. So you might ask yourself, well, what's going on here in my main office? Because perhaps the filtration mechanism needs to be improved. And I think Vivian can talk more about that. But by seeing what's going on outdoors and indoors, you can see when you're not managing things correctly for the human occupant. And then finally, and again, I could talk for days about each one of these points, but are we worth it? What is the value of a healthy human being? And when you're trying to create a return on investment, it's different for different building types. Schools, at least public schools are reimbursed according to the standardized test results. So if you can improve the performance of your students, decrease absenteeism by decreasing asthma or other things that are related to indoor air quality, kids do better on scores. They get more reimbursement from the federal government. That's part of the process of showing the return on investment of a healthy person. And every building type has a different set of KPIs, or as Joe Allen says, HPIs. But by using this data and correlating it with human performance, I think we can create very convincing cost-benefit analyses to help move this endeavor forward. And I've been doing that for the last several years. So next steps, I hope we can actually scale the use of real-time indoor and outdoor air measurements, taking a holistic approach, analyze these through a health lens, and operate our buildings both efficiently in terms of energy as well as for the health benefits of the occupant. Establish robust ROI metrics, and I hope nobody's a lawyer or takes offense, but fear of legal consequences often, in my experience, makes people nervous about collecting indoor air data that relates to health. So we need to find some sort of protection around litigation. Thank you. That's it for me for now.
Thank you, Stephanie. So next up, we're going to have Vivian present. Let's see.
I will jump in. So that was really instructional. Thank you. I'm going to sort of build on Stephanie's presentation with a little bit of overlap, but try to focus on the solution set that is being developed or advanced for, most specifically for larger commercial buildings, not for residential and small commercial. And I'm going to talk about what pollutants seem to matter, what building systems seem to be most critical to get right, and whether operation and maintenance is the biggest challenge, or the actual room delivery of fresh air is the biggest challenge, or whether the problem is in the central air handler, and maybe how we can prioritize and innovate to solve those range of problems. I just want to start by giving credit where it's due. The General Service Administration has taken a leadership role in the White House Clean Air in Buildings Challenge to actually be an exemplar of innovation, implementation, and standards, and to establish a national program to verify that there is proper ventilation in federally owned buildings, and then to actually map out some real world research with experts and researchers to get subject matter experts together and to share leading practices with the larger community. So some of what I'm presenting is a result of the first initiative that GSA, or the first two initiatives that GSA has launched. They held an expert workshop in May of this year with about 35 attendees, including Seema and Stephanie and many others that may actually be in the room on this conference. And in a pre-workshop survey on which pollutants have the biggest short-term impact to health and performance, 6 pollutants stood out as being critical. Viruses, particulates that were generated indoors, specifically PM 2.5, PM 2.5 generated outdoors, in many cases associated with wildfires, mold, formaldehyde, and carbon dioxide, or as an indicator, or the absence of oxygen or of fresh air. They also looked at pollutants that had the greatest long-term impact, and you'll see again, particulates both generated indoors and outdoors sort of top the list in the group of experts ranking pollutants. Then formaldehyde, viruses, which include, of course, COVID and flus and colds and other concerns. Then small particulates or fine particulates, PM1 generated indoors, mold, and then PM1 generated outdoors rose to the top of this long list of possible pollutants of concern. The reason this matters is because the solution set has to target something, and even the environmental monitoring that Stephanie was speaking about has to target certain things. And so knowing what we should target for short and long-term health is an important variable. And at the moment, the best way to do that is to crowdsource the experts, especially the medical experts. That same group of experts were also asked about which HVAC, so heating, ventilation, air conditioning, mechanical interventions should be prioritized to improve the indoor air quality, not the full indoor environmental quality, but the indoor air quality for human health and both short-term and long-term concerns. And the things that rose to the top of this list for the central air handler were get the filter type and condition right, make sure the filter is installed and sealed well, correct the fan controls so they're actually delivering air at the level they should be, size the outside air intake to ensure the amount of outside air, improve the air side economizer so we have sensors and actuators and building automation system interfaces to get the economizer working. That brings in more outside air when the conditions are right outdoors, which includes that they're not polluted and not too hot or humid and not too cold or outside of natural conditioning zones. And then trying to get improved building automation control, and then improving and making sure that the outside air intake locations and conditions are actually in good condition. At the room level, a whole different set of issues popped up, because even though the central air handler may be doing an excellent job of getting air out of the equipment, it may be doing a terrible job of getting it to the room or the zone that it serves. And most large commercial buildings have an average of 30 to 40 air handlers, and many of them will have as many as 80 air handlers in them. So these large buildings have a lot of air handlers that may or may not be performing equally in delivering to the zone or the room, to the individual terminal unit, the diffuser over your head. The issues that the experts began to focus on were proper ongoing operation and maintenance of the HVAC system, the need to retro-commission or continuously commission HVAC systems, to use automated fault detection. I'm going to come back to this as a much more aggressively than we are today, to do 5-year test and balancing. All these are really making sure you've got the expertise in the field to run the system. And then to make sure that there's good clean air flow in the zone, and there are other things to doing that, and introducing zone air quality sensors, which Stephanie just mentioned. So we ended up with this expert workshop breaking up into 5 working groups, and we met twice and people changed groups. How do we improve O&M? How do we improve clean air in the room or the zone? How do we improve the air handlers' outside air delivery? How do we improve the air handlers' filter? And how do we, in fact, improve the air handlers' supply return air fans and the system balancing? So we had these breakouts, and let me tell you a little bit what we found. So number one in all the breakout rooms was O&M is just not strong enough. And it's not strong enough for a number of reasons. One is that there are no standards for sensing or assessing IAQ at the workstation level or even at the room level. There are also no standard surveys for engaging occupants as IAQ sensors, even though there are surveys out there, and NIOSH and CBE and others have surveys that ask people satisfaction with the environment, ask them about their health concerns. There are no standards, and as a consequence, occupants are not feeding back into the system. So we don't know that some zones are not working well in a building that may have 60 different zones. And there is consensus building for the importance of adding new indices for CO2 and PM2.5 and VOC sensing that are showing up in ASHRAE and RESET and WELL with thresholds of acceptability. The cost, reliability, and the database for these wide sensors is still daunting. We still don't yet have a way in which to allow for thousands of sensors to show up in buildings and actually affect change. There's also a long-term underfunding of facility maintenance and staffing. It's actually a National Academy study identified that it's basically less than 1.5% of the current plant value. So if you actually put a value on your building, it's about 1.5% that's invested every year in maintaining the building, which means there is crises overtake routine maintenance, staffing is being reduced, outsourcing is being aggressively pursued, turnover is rapid, absenteeism is substantial. So we really don't necessarily have enough people on site to keep everything at top performance. So maybe the solution is to develop new key performance indicators, new building KPIs to advance O&M investment, because we're underinvesting in our buildings, and O&M expertise. And that could include measuring IAQ at every zone or every workstation, which is what Stephanie just alluded to. It could include surveying users to understand both the environmental satisfaction as well as health indices, which could include things like the NIOSH SBS survey. And it could include solidifying industries' fault detection or its condition assessment. So there's a way in which we're constantly picking up the errors in the field. At some point, we probably should put a line in the sand instead of just citing one National Academy or two National Academy studies on the cost of ownership, to really know what do we need to invest in buildings in terms of budget, manpower, training, and reduced turnover and absenteeism. So I'm just going to quickly show you a few examples. We have had the privilege with the General Service Administration to go out into, in this case, 64 buildings and measure CO2 at individual workstations. So this is a building, and these are all the workstations that were measured in that building. And at the same time, we asked them whether they were satisfied with the quality of air. And if we took a ASHRAE threshold of 1,000 parts per million, we would have a lot of red dots in that 1,000 parts per million. If you would actually reassess that down to 600 parts per million, you would start to see a predominance of green dots, right? So statistically, we can tell that occupants feel the air is fresher when CO2 levels are below 600. And in fact, the statistical analysis shows that if we get it under 600 parts per million, we're pretty much on a 7-point satisfaction scale going to find that we're predominantly in this satisfied or very satisfied with the air quality. So this begins to give us a slightly different threshold than what do we need for just health? What do we need for satisfaction, which might relate to our productivity and health? In terms of prioritizing fault detection and diagnostics, so in the IBM suite, it's called Sparks. In the Johnson Controls, it's called Alerts. I mean, we have faults in the Siemens group. I mean, there's every building automation system has a term to describe what's going wrong with the various mechanical components. And if you start to prioritize those components that might relate to the quality of air, and here's 11 of those example faults. Takes, for example, the terminal unit airflow set point is unreachable, meaning that it cannot actually deliver the air that it should be delivering. If you start to see those faults showing up, we've got an air problem. Or the air handling unit's OA damper is stuck closed, means there's no fresh air delivery. And this often happens in very hot and cold periods. So if we started to take our fault detection more seriously, we probably would have better solutions for indoor air. At the room level, it's a whole different suite of solutions, not at the air handler, but at the room level. In this case, the in-room air delivery is not monitored at all. We don't really know how much air is reaching every diffuser. We know what the damper position is, we know what the pressure sensors are saying, but we don't actually know how much fresh air. And that's why CO2 sensors are beginning to show up in individual zones. And it may be necessary that we change our commitment to thermostats to a commitment to a thermostatic IAQ and occupancy sensor. So every thermostat would be changed. And it certainly is beginning to tell us that we may have to do in-room filtration to ensure the equivalent OA is actually achieving what it needs to at the room. So let me just talk about both of those. So Ecobee, you guys, most of you in the room know Nest and Ecobee are the two sort of leading smart thermostats in homes around North America. And originally all they measured was temperature. Well, Ecobee has come out with a new thermostat that measures temperature as well as TVOCs and CO2. So and outside air AQIs. So it basically tries to give you a score for your air quality as well as a score for your thermal conditions. Imagine if this now becomes part of every zone in every mechanical zone in every building. This is a dramatic shift in the way in which we're controlling our central mechanical systems. The Swiss are ahead of us, the Europeans are ahead of us. They're already looking at CO2 as a standard side-by-side index. And it's not just for demand controlled ventilation, which is really about necking down the ventilation when there's nobody there to save energy, and then increasing the ventilation when there's too many people in a conference room. So demand control ventilation is a good idea if you turn it on its head and use it to actually increase ventilation rate whenever occupant density increases. The second solution is in-room HEPA, and these probably should coexist. So this is and/or in-room UVGI. It's becoming very clear that having filters at every desk, HEPA filters at every desk, or at least in every group of desks, is having a significant impact on reducing particulate matter, which in turn has been carrying the COVID virus from one occupant to the next. The important thing, though, is to make sure we buy them at an affordable rate, that they're quiet, and that they're maintainable, because if they get compromised over time, we might actually make the air worse. So we really need to have a whole new process of using HEPA filters in occupied spaces and maintaining them. The last piece of the puzzle, so we're trying to improve O&M, we're trying to improve room delivery of equivalent OA, and now we're trying to get the central air handler to be better. I've already mentioned that we've got to get filters to be a better quality, and we need to probably increase the amount of outside air. In fact, I shouldn't say probably, we need to increase the amount of outside air, and I'm going to talk about both of those. GSA did an extensive cross building study of 62 buildings across all of their regions and measured the delivery of air going in and out of every air handler, as well as the filter condition, the filter type, the presence of economizer. They did a lot of evaluation called the NOVA study. And these are the locations they've done these studies in. And it actually has revealed air handlers that are doing, and this is just a single building, that all the air handlers in this building lined up, and the number of air handlers that are exceeding the ASHRAE minimum, which is the gray line, is all of them. Some of them are a little bit higher than the design OA, which could be a good thing in the time of COVID, and a few of them are a little bit lower than the design OA. And so one index that we could put to buildings is ongoing reports like this on every air handler in a building. This is just a group of buildings which show the outside air delivery rate. And it shows when they're red that they're under delivering against ASHRAE standards, and in the light green that they're over 160% of the design OA, which could be over ventilating, although it is a well goal, so it may be just right in the time of COVID. So you can see that a group of buildings are operating in different ways. The filters that are out in the field, at least in federal buildings that GSA is managing, were almost all MERV 13 or higher. 91% of them, of these buildings, had a mix of pre and final filters. 75% of those filters were in good condition. And of the final filters, 13, 14, and 15 dominated them. The OA damper conditions, only 52% of the OA dampers were in good condition. That leaves us with 48% that have various issues. They were faulty building automation connections, faulty dampers, faulty sensors. So we've got some OA issues out in the field that need to be fixed for improving the outside air. And then economizer does exist in about 60% of the large federal buildings. But when they looked for the OA airflow sensors for those economizers, 37% of them were in good conditions and 50% of them could not be located at all. So that meant it's not clear what's driving the economizer. So the solution set is definitely MERV 13 or better. I mean, you can see it in the ASHRAE standards. You can't really go up to MERV 14, 15, 16 for all air handlers because they can't handle the pressure. But as soon as we move away from the 8s and the 10s that are in a lot of buildings, we start to see a significant reduction in certain particle sizes that are related to Zika and COVID and wildfire and bacteria and respiratory droplets that exchange colds and flus. We also find that if we expand economizer, we can save energy and reduce infection. This study by Pisani et al. Was published in 2022, and it showed that by expanding the economizer use, they were able to increase ventilation rate by at least 50% with energy savings and reduce probability of infection. My last slides really have to do with dedicated outside air systems. I know it's extremely difficult to retrofit in existing buildings, although it is possible. An in-depth study by NYSERDA and IMT have identified a series of small commercial buildings where they've put in a dedicated outside air unit with a energy recovery and separate heat pumps. So any building that is electrifying today should in fact be looking at dedicated outside air as a separate delivery from the heat pumps, which will then be tied to fan coil units in the zones. That way we can at long last separate the delivery of thermal conditions from the delivery of breathing air conditions. We should not be bundling them because often the thermostat's not calling for air because of heat loss or heat gain from the outside when it should be calling for air. And we need to get these systems split. And this study by PG&E identified that a dedicated outside air could save between 40 and 66% of energy and increase ventilation rates up to 140%. And they're already seeing that 20% of new buildings have separate dedicated outside air with thermal conditioning separate and 5% of retrofit in the California context. So this is really, we have to get rid of the HVAC word and come up with an HAC and a V word. Let's pull the ventilation and make it separate. Once we do that, we will be able to allow for natural ventilation. We'll be able to be more thermally dynamic. Now, why is that important? I'm sure everybody in the room knows that circadian rhythm and the research that went on about daylight was incredibly striking. And this is the last 10 years that we've understood how important it is for humans to be exposed to early morning red, then blue, and late afternoon red, because the blue light triggers serotonin, which is a natural antidepressant that wakes us up. And the red light late in the day triggers melatonin, which is helping us to sleep. And with daylight, we all of a sudden are healthier. We have better physical health, mental health, better moods, and better physical energy. If it took us this long to realize how important daylight is, how long is it going to take us to figure out that dynamic thermal conditions, which nature have? It's much cooler in the morning, gets warmer in the afternoon, gets cooler at night, and ventilation rates and the amount of airflow changes at different times of day. So we need to make daylight dominant, embrace sunlight. There's a lot of economic studies that help to make this justification. We need to open windows, collaborate outdoors, like this convention center in Cape Town. We need to celebrate thermally dynamic environments by letting people open windows. If you separate ventilation from thermal, you can let people open windows because the ventilation system will be constant volume. I want to end there. It's just so important for me that people really embrace the notion that nature has a better, healthier environment for us. And we obviously, there are times when we need to filter the outside air because of wildfires and outdoor pollutants, but there's absolutely times when we need to embrace it. And that is the importance of balancing what we do for indoor health with how we embrace outdoor health. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there and pass it to Seema.
Thank you so much, Vivian. We've had a lot of questions come in, and I'm going to hold them for the chat. Hold them for the panel discussion after the presentation. The one I wanted to get to is, Vivian, you mentioned a NOVA study. Is the link available to that study? One of the questions was about access to that.
Not yet. I mean, the study is in GSA's hands, so we can needle them and see if we can get it out.
Okay, the answer is stay tuned. So with that, let's give our attention to Seema, who's going to talk about indoor air quality standards. Take it away, Seema.
Great, thanks, Chris. And thanks, Vivian and Stephanie, for really inspiring and informative and rich presentations. I'm sure everyone's really keen to get to the Q&A and the panel discussion. So I can assure you this I'm closing out with a more lightweight. I'm going to share a lot of opinions, a little bit more in the vein of social science than science, a mix here. So, as you listen to what I'm about to share, I just would really invite everyone to think about what do you agree with, what do you disagree with from what I'm saying, and just come prepared for the next part with all of those opinions to match up against mine. So let me get this keyboard. Today, I'm going to be discussing a few of the prominent indoor air quality milestones from the last year and what has driven them. Beyond the glaring fact of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think my co-panelists also talked about how, yes, COVID had a big impact, but there were trends underway before that. And standards are one piece of it. There's also been guidelines, partnerships, calls to action. There's been a lot of activity in my 20 plus years in this field. I don't think there's been another period in the past that's been so active from a industry-wide, public, private, government, nonprofits, academia, where indoor air quality is concerned. And I'm going to dial it back to where I think Professor Loftness started here as well, with the spring of last year. So a little more than a year, where the White House Clean Air Challenge was issued and really caused a big splash, not necessarily because it had any groundbreaking content as such, but very significant for the White House to be implicitly taking a stance on indoor air. And I would trace it back for a minute, even further back to, early in the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, when a group, I think that's been famously dubbed since then, for the group of 239 experts from a number of countries wrote a letter to the WHO calling for the agency to acknowledge that the virus is airborne. And that took a while, and that step finally also happened, and that step being the WHO saying COVID is airborne at a similar time last 2 springs ago as the White House announcement. So let's just trace a few more milestones from there. Fast forward to 2023, 2 massive developments this year. The CDC posted a new target for ventilation in May of this year. It's a non-binding guideline, but I know from my time in commercial real estate, anything that the CDC puts out is extremely impactful, because as at the time I was in the building owner operator space. I know tenants, users, a lot of us commonly look to cite and refer to what the CDC says. And then ASHRAE created this brand new standard 241 from tip to tail in under 6 months. So, it establishes requirements for an infection risk management mode. And again, not a regulation, so it has to be adopted by a jurisdiction and put into building codes to be binding, but it provides a set of recommended minimum performance criteria and standard. And none of what I've said shared so far represents something binding. So there is still an accountability gap, and that brings me to Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security's initiative to craft a model state Indoor Air Quality Act. The public launch of that is tomorrow, so I reserve further comment on that topic for tomorrow's event. Invite people to attend who are interested in it. And, there are many other events, many other efforts, many of them fairly significant by nonprofits, academics, various state and federal agencies. California is doing groundbreaking work. And then Professor Loftness talked much more in depth than this one little snapshot I've put up here of the leadership GSA, the U.S. General Services Administration is, has launched. And finally, I'll just close out this section on milestones by noting that, especially since this is the world I now occupy of green building frameworks and standards, that these have been addressing health and indoor air quality for decades and evolving toward a more performance-based approach. And of course, these are voluntary standards that incentivize action through recognition. And putting all of that together, there's a lot happening. And though there's a lot happening, I would say we're just getting started. So it's this, kind of dynamic tension between those two sentiments. And, I think Professor Loftness said this in much more detail. And Dr. Taylor's that indoor air quality is really complex. It's kind of intrinsically cross-functional. You can't just stick it in one function in real estate or one department of the government to address very easily, because it touches on a lot of pieces and this goal of coordinated, consistent, both efficient and effective and equitable indoor air quality management that, includes clear lines of accountability. That's still a ways off and includes a lot of, requires answering a lot of these pretty hard questions as an industry, as a collective. And with that, I'll switch to sort of part two of two of this presentation, which is really about, why are these things happening? Why now? What has changed? What's driving them? And that could be a long conversation on its own. So I've just picked 5 trend areas that I think have been big drivers to discuss today. So number one, knowledge. Our knowledge base has really expanded. And again, this is just a nod to the great presentation Stephanie had earlier. I won't repeat. And then our available solutions, we're able to do a lot more in terms of the building, operating the building, designing the building, than we knew how to do before. So again, these are the left-hand side picture is a picture I pulled from Vivian's deck. So just as a reminder that she talked about that. So I'm not gonna rehash it, and I'll just close out here with sort of 3 trends. So number one is this major driver that climate change is no longer something we're preparing to adapt to, or that's affecting populations out there that might be vulnerable, or affecting me if I live near a wildfire zone or a flood zone. At least in the United States, I know we might have an international audience here, but the direct impacts of our changing climate have been really at the forefront of our mind this summer, with almost daily headlines on heat waves, air pollution events, creating this heightened sense of urgency. Might even call it an inflection point around the need for adaptation and resilient design, along with climate mitigation for health. So we have this challenge now of needing to maintain indoor air quality, comfort, and safety, ideally improve it, not just maintain it, because we know how important it is, but maintain it under this increasing pressure from, at a minimum, maintain it, increasing pressure from heat, precipitation, wildfires, allergens. We already know infectious disease transmission is on that list, while we also, address pretty aggressive decarbonization targets. And then number 4, indoor air quality sensor technology for widespread commercial use has matured. Again, both my co-panelists spoke to this, so I'll just, kind of reiterate that we now have this capability to measure in buildings in a way that we couldn't before, this sort of 24/7 distributed building performance and verification monitoring. And we all agree on the potential of what it can do for us in terms of fault detection, adaptive control. But there's currently a disconnect between the rapid pace of growth and development in the technology and then the slow change in on-the-ground practice. James Dice, who runs, along with Rosie Khalif, the Nexus Labs group, had a post just today pointing out this fast but slow kind of tension and challenge. And I think we'll be getting more into this, into why that is in the panel discussion. So I'll just leave you with two quick thoughts at this stage, which is, one, that technology is a tool, it's deployed by people. So the technology needs to advance, but the human systems also need to advance, workflows, training. I think Vivian actually really spoke to this in talking about that investment in the O&M, the human piece of the O&M. And then the second, borrowed from an IAQ colleague, Liam Bates, so I don't simply plagiarize here, is that, we really need to get better at converting oceans of data points into insights that can be acted on. So when we talk about metrics, we're not talking about like a single point, single minute concentration of CO2 or PM 2.5, but we're talking about the kinds of things that Vivian and Stephanie started to tee up for us. What do these aggregated metrics that are insightful for action look like? And then finally, number 5, 5 of 5, so almost done here. Expectations have changed. We used to only think about indoor air quality in a building. Even being an indoor air quality scientist, it was low on my list of what I thought about when I entered a building, unless something was palpably bad or really great. And then I noticed it, mold on the wall or like an amazing view. But now the combination of sort of post-COVID heightened awareness on the one hand that indoor air quality matters, combined with optionality of where to work, this sort of hybrid work world that we have, has made occupants more like consumers. And the ready availability of sensors makes it easy for someone entering a building to just check on things, check on parameters before they get to levels when they might have felt them. So no longer, innocent until proven guilty. There's sort of this demand, homegrown demand for proactive verification and assurances. So I pause there. This is a summary of the things I talked about, and hand the baton back to you, Chris.
Well, thank you, Seema, and thanks to all three of you for excellent presentations. We're going to switch gears now and get into our panel discussion segment of this session. And I know there's a lot of building owners out there in the audience, so I wanted to start off with a practical brass tacks, rubber hits the road, whatever metaphor is the right one, about this question of air particulate and wildfire smoke. This was a thing that was real present on the West Coast. We had Smoke Week in Seattle here and down in LA, I know, and in Los Angeles every summer. And now we're seeing that more widespread. Our colleagues on the East Coast are experiencing that. So I'd like to get our panel's take on, first off, what do we know about the impact of the smoke particulate on human health? And then maybe secondarily, what's advice for facility operators to how to think about how they change the operations of their buildings for periods of time when less outdoor air might be superior to more outside air? So maybe I'll let Seema kick that one off and then let others chime in.
Yes, yeah, this is an area where fortunately we know a lot about the health effects, and what we know is very, very deeply established. I will say, and hopefully when I hand the baton, I'm sure Stephanie can speak much more deeply to this, that there's lots of debate and emerging knowledge around the edges on what attributes of PM are the worst for health, what's the right aggregate metric, what the impacts on body systems that are less known, say neurological, reproductive, but the impact on especially pulmonary and cardiovascular. Again, as a non-medical person, that's been my takeaway, that those are have a deep evidence base. So we certainly know enough about the health effects to motivate us to act using any metric, PM 2.5, in spite of its insufficiency. In terms of what to do when less outdoor air might be superior, and again, I'll leave it to Vivian to speak more deeply and from the researcher perspective, and I'll speak more from the commercial real estate perspective of being in that world for a bit, which is, we saw many well-meaning facilities managers here in California during wildfire season, even that wildfire season that overlapped with COVID, turn off outdoor airflows during wildfire smoke episodes to sort of, again, shift this balance, as you were saying, Chris. And, first of all, this is not legal. Commercial buildings need a minimum required outdoor air. And so you really need a wildfire mode analogous to ASHRAE 241 that's giving us an infection risk management mode. And you especially need that when you are in infection risk management mode to be kind of intelligently balancing the two. And, what would be in that mode? It is the things that we would expect, yes, reduce outdoor air probably to a minimum, as is possible through balancing infection risk, filter grade, installation, maintenance, amount of recirculated airflow, managing pressurization, infiltration, having a monitor to see if what you're doing is working, have the supplemental filter, as needed, is my sort of ready list.
Stephanie, were you jumping in? You're on mute.
Yeah, I just said I'd love to take a stab at this as well. But first I wanted to say to Vivian and to Seema, thank you so much. I just learned so much from your presentations, and also I'm so grateful to know that all of us are working on this. But in terms of health harm from wildfires, in my opinion, it falls into two sort of categories. One is the particulate matter, which you can also often sense or see in the air, as well as monitor. Then there are the other components like carbon monoxide or ozone, NO2, SO2 that are sometimes follow after the particulate matter phase is clearly evident. And those things need to be managed as well. Because they're not particles and are not visible, I'm a huge proponent of monitoring essential components outdoors. And I also wanted to highlight that, unfortunately, we're sometimes creating wildfire-like conditions indoors. We're not aware if we can't sense what's in the building. So this is going beyond comfort, because comfort is perceptible. But what happens if the ozone level is high outdoors? If you're not monitoring that, you bring the ozone into your building, and it can react with VOCs and create particles. So I think it's super important for us to be aware holistically of what's indoors and what's outdoors, so that we don't have indoor chemical reactions that create the same hazards as those we see during outdoor catastrophic events. So the things we can see and things we can't see, and there are chemical reactions that are impactful to our health.
Yeah, I think, Chris, I would just echo that. I think there is a need for environmental monitoring at the building level outdoors, so that we know. And there are other things that might, in fact, be, when you look at outside air intake, a lot of buildings end up having their OA intake at the loading dock, because it's a big, clumsy, aesthetically ugly set of grills, and the loading dock is, not the front door, and which of course means you could get diesel fumes. I mean, there's so many things that a good outdoor air monitor for what you're bringing in. And then, as Seema said, I think Seema's list is exactly the right list. I mean, you may end up going to minimums, but you shouldn't go below minimums. You definitely will be, your filters will probably need to be maintained at a more rapid scale, but the filters are having a big impact on reducing at least the particulate components. And I'm not as well versed in how well they do on ozone and NO2, but the filter banks in central air handlers, you might be safer going to work than staying home in a wildfire if you don't have any filtration at home, right? And then in-room HEPA, of course, is a really good way to help clean up localized air pollutants. So I feel like it's a pretty healthy start. Even though,
and can I just put a nod in for humidification? mid-range humidity brings particles out of the air. Mid-range humidity helps neutralize indoor VOCs, and it hydrates your mucosal surfaces, so your respiratory immunity is more robust. We tend to forget about it because for a number of reasons, but that 40 to 60% relative humidity zone is very good for our health and for cleaning the air. Assuming you don't have a building envelope that promotes other problems.
So Stephanie, one of the cautionary words that I put into that is certainly for dehumidification, it's no question, right? If you've got an extremely humid outdoor, you want to bring it down within the 40 to 60%. But humidification comes with secondary maintenance issues that in many cases the field teams aren't as well versed and the technology is not as robust. And so I think enthalpy recovery wheels is one way to improve humidity but they too need to be maintained. I mean, this is hardware that in some cases has complexity that field teams may or may not be educated in. But
no, Vivian, I hear you, and I know, and
I think you're right. I think having the sweet spot of humidity is ideal, but getting there is maybe not ideal at the low end, right?
I just want to point out that mammals who live in dry environments, our lungs recede more deeply into our bodies because you need saturated air for gas exchange. So if we're a fish and we have water around us, our gills and our gas exchange is right there. So I guess I would have to ask, how deep can we go? We don't manage humidity. How deep are our lungs? They're going to be in our bellies before long if we're not careful. In cold, dry climates. So, but I do hear you that there are a multitude of issues.
Yeah, so maybe let's sort of unpack the comfort question a little bit. This is the Smart Building Exchange Conference is really centered in many ways on thinking about building data and how building data can inform better operations, better occupant experience. And I wanted to think about that a little bit from an IEQ perspective. A lot of times when we talk about indoor environmental quality, we're talking about occupant comfort. And the definition of occupant comfort is something that has empirical dimensions to it, but in reality, everybody's experience of comfort is quite subjective. So I'm curious about, should we be relying more on measured data for indoor environmental metrics and stop using the word comfort? And if so, how do we make the transition to that? And how do we start to quantify high quality indoor environmental experience across the multiplicity of perceptions of occupants?
So can I speak up once again?
Yeah, I'll let you go.
So in terms of quantifying across the, however you just said it very eloquently, Chris, that's what my team's been working very hard on. I have taken a healthy dislike to the comfort, I call it the C word, because it only captures what you can perceive. And there are many health consequences which are imperceptible. So that's number one. There are many things you can't perceive. I think if you have a healthy indoor environment, you have a comfortable indoor environment because you're supporting the brain, you're supporting neuroendocrine pathways that end up in being in comfort. So, and like you said, there's so many, men and women are different. Elderly people, younger people, we're all different. So I don't think ultimately comfort is the most objective way to assess good indoor air quality, but it's where we are right now, largely.
Yeah, I think, because I think the combination of engaging occupants in assessing satisfaction and comfort and measuring the environmental conditions will yield a better outcome than either or working alone, right? It's the combination of the two that tell the critical story. The reason I talk about circadian light is that truthfully, 20 years ago, none of us knew that we didn't just need 500 lux of light on every work surface. And that would provide productivity, health, we would be home free, and all we had to do was uniform lighting across the workspace. And now we realize, there's something else in nature that we missed, that isn't just having the right level for visual acuity. There's a whole content question, and I still think there's content issues related to thermal variability and to the quantity of air we're breathing and the condition of the air, including the humidity of the air. I'm sort of intrigued, Stephanie, that you used a nature analogy to talk about lung dimensions, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, that's what we need to know, is how do we adapt, and are we forcing the body to adapt inappropriately? I definitely think we shouldn't be in 22 degrees Celsius, 365-day environments. I mean, just total numbing conditions, which presumably is in the comfort zone for both winter and summer clothing. But it's just, it's not an answer to what really impacts the full health of humans.
Yeah, I'll echo that piece about, I was very intrigued by research I heard about earlier this year of the potential benefits of discomfort, I think was the tagline there. It was research out of the Netherlands, I believe, and talking about, I believe obesity was an endpoint, and just looking at the value to health of Vivian, what you just talked about, like a more variable. So a rhythm, not just in the light, but also in the temperature. So not looking at uniformity as our holy grail. And two other quick things. I think this is also an issue of, when you think about, I agree that I think there has to be a combination of, I think the non-perceivable stuff definitely matters, but there's also things that are not measurable. So I think there's a Venn diagram there of what we can measure, what we can perceive, in the family of what's important. And then I think fundamentally metrics are not the same as data. So Vivian, I'm picturing your slide you had there, and Stephanie, you had that too, about combining individual data points into metrics. And I think that's really hard. I think that's where we're at. And that's what we need to figure out for the industry, because we're definitely struggling where we're trying to use data, trying to use a CO2 level or a PM level as an indicator for action, because we need something that combines measurable and non-measurable things. But when we do have metrics, we have like 100 different aggregate metrics across all our different kind of industries and efforts. So, I think that's where we're at, and that's the challenge for us moving forward.
I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate the sentiment that dynamic environments are more important, more rich, more variable environments are more important. And that's not the way we've thought about buildings for a long time. I want to get to an audience question, which I think maybe some of you are aware of this. So there was a question about the pretty well-known Harvard McNaughton study that was done that looked at productivity and CO2 concentrations in buildings. Somebody asked the question, outlining what Vivian had mentioned about improvements in workplace performance cognition have a substantial dollar value. I know, Vivian, you've pioneered a lot of work in connecting the dots between performance and building attributes and economic return on investment. The question says that it's been called into question by a recent ASHRAE study last year as to whether or not that study holds water. What do you think about the question of indoor air quality and cognition and building performance?
Can I start here?
Yeah, go.
Being the oldest one, probably. So I'm not familiar with it being questioned, but I think in that questioning, there are a couple of factors. Is the challenge about the veracity of CO, that's primarily CO2 that's looked at for. I think that's a Joe Allen study, right, Chris?
Yes.
Yeah. So is CO2 what's really having the impact? Or are there other confounding variables that could be responsible for the outcome? So again, I'm not familiar with what the challenge is, but from my perspective, I think CO2 is not all that we need to be following. And it may not be a surrogate for some other important components. So that's just my input.
I was trying to piece together the question. One other thing that was noted was that in Vivian's slide showing pushing indoor CO2 concentrations below 600 ppm would put you in the range of this higher cognition, or would keep you in the range where your cognition wasn't impaired. So I guess the idea is that a compounding argument for lower CO2 concentrations in indoor environments.
So Chris, let me also make a comment. First place, Piers McNaughton and Joe Allen and Jack Spangler and others worked with the University of Syracuse and New York State, Syracuse, to, I think, do one of the most robust studies that has been published. And they varied, not only, they seeded the air with CO2, so there is definitely a response to CO2 in terms of end of day, last hour of sort of strategic thinking gaming. They also, though, introduced TVOCs, or VOCs, and I'm going to speak out of pocket a little bit here, but they were looking at the importance of getting a control over the chemistry in our indoor materials, and showed a measurable drop. Now, we do not have good measures of productivity. I mean, white collar productivity is as vague as what you and I and all of us are doing on a typical day, right? I mean, but the test has been used for looking at all kinds of impairment related to both drugs and alcohol. So there's a huge database of millions of people who've taken. So it is, I have not also read the ASHRAE article trying to refute this, but I'm pretty convinced that they put a line in the sand that said ventilation rate matters. And my argument is it should never be more than 200 parts per million above outdoors. It's not like 600 is the magic. It's that nature has provided, we've evolved in a natural environment, of course, not in the last 100 years or so, but until we started doing 90% indoors, we evolved in a more natural environment. And there's something in that natural environment we have to continue to track. And so that I really think that there's sort of this sweet spot around 200 parts per million above outdoors that we should stay under. The codes and standards are not that aggressive at this point.
If I might chime in, Chris, as well, because this is a hot topic for sure in the industry. And I think it points at, this is a bit of a generic comment, but I'm going to say, I think it points at another kind of broad challenge, which is that it's very hard as a practitioner to understand how to sort standards of evidence. So, I think that would be really helpful for the industry if we can start to develop and then apply and communicate levels of certainty around different bodies of, especially the health evidence base, which is, backed up by methodology that, experts in the indoor air health field know how to parse. But in my head, for instance, to provide a bit of a, not exactly a dissenting view, I don't know if y'all would dissent or not with this, but I think of the health evidence base on PM 2.5 establishing its cardiovascular effects as, deep and established. And by established, I think it's replicable within the population studied, it's generalizable to other populations. It's very meaningful in the sense of, other exposures that affect the same health endpoint are, PM 2.5 is sort of significant, not just in a statistical sense, but in a meaningfulness for that person's life sense. And it's, yes, I had a short list of things like that. So I think having a sense like that of how to think about different exposures and their health effects and how to weigh them and interpret them would be really helpful. So
can I just speak up again here? Because I agree with both you, Vivian and Seema, about what you said. But I also believe that, as we've talked about, that the combination of these things is critical. And so, for example, with the Joe Allen study, I say Joe Allen because I know him, but I was dismayed that humidity wasn't controlled for, because it's so important. And the study that I love, and Vivian, you might have been one of the researchers on this, is the Brian Gilligan, the GSA study, Well-Being in Well-Built, that was in the ISIAC journal, I think it was 2020, which looked at, and this is a great approach in my opinion, looked at physiological measures of stress, like salivary cortisol, heart rate variability, which Seema relates to your cardiovascular status, as well as sleep outside the office, like literally putting people into sleep lab type conditions, but looking at physiological metrics and then relating those to the indoor environmental conditions and using questionnaires. Vivian, did you do that study, Vivian? Were you part of it? No, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Are you familiar with it?
Yes, absolutely. No, I was actually a part of the review team for it, but Esther Sternberg at Arizona led that study with a team of researchers. Individuals wore personal monitors that were full suite air quality monitors, as well as sort of the Fitbit equation of amount of activity. And they were looking for statistical significance between environmental conditions and a range of health symptoms, including stress. A very important study. And you're right, it did show that humidity mattered in that study. I think one of the challenges we have to come up with when we talk about humidity is relative humidity is relative to temperature. It's not an absolute. So we have to know exactly what the thermal condition, as you said, these are interrelated phenomena. We have to know what temperatures at which those humidities are existing, because the cooler the space,
Right.
essentially the same amount of moisture will show a higher relative humidity, right?
Right.
And in Texas, where a lot of those data sets, I think a lot of them were done in Texas, they run those buildings very cold. So, we're, anyway, but it's a very important, again, another very important study trying to look at the physiological and not in this case productivity, but physiological response of humans to different indoor environmental quality conditions. And yes,
Thank you.
Brian Gilligan at GSA, who also has led all these was the project lead on that, right?
So one of the themes of each of your presentations was evidence-based design, using research, thinking about the return on investment for improved indoor environmental quality. There's, speaking to our building owners, there's a lot of uncertainty right now in the commercial office market. It's changing, uses more variable. What would your advice be to building owners as to how to leverage emergent trends and awareness in healthy buildings and improved indoor environmental quality, and the changing dynamics of in-person work and what we go in for to help position their individual buildings or their building portfolios to create competitive advantage and to attract and retain tenants?
So Chris, I think that's
commercial offices or all buildings.
Feel free to take it however you like. I'm bringing up the office example because it's probably seen the biggest change, but I feel free to expand on typology.
Yeah, I think the office building has the most variability. I mean, schools are being occupied the way they were, hospitals are being occupied the way they were, restaurants are being occupied the way they were in a sense, but offices are not being occupied the way they were. And there's a couple of good things about that, Chris. I mean, number one, people stay home when they have colds and in flus. That's good, right? And you can still work. I mean, the reason we went to work with a cold is because we A, had too much to do, and B, because we didn't want to threaten our job, right, by not showing up. And now you can acceptably stay home and say, I have a cold, I don't want to give to everybody. So I think we're going to reduce some of the going to work sick problems that we had. I also think another good thing that happened because of COVID is that we're no longer densifying. I was appalled. I did a lot of work with Steelcase and Herman Miller and Knoll and the furniture world. And when we started, the average net workstation size was 120 square feet per person. And then it was 100, and then it was 80, and then it was 64, and then it was 48. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? You're going to put people at that density. The mechanical system was never designed to stuff that many people shoulder to shoulder, and people lay it out like Starbucks, where you're literally on a bar, shoulder to shoulder. And I think we may have sort of bottomed out and people will go back to work and it'll be a little less compressed, and that will be good too. Having said that, we probably are going to go back to work to collaborate. So we're going to need to design more collaboration spaces that have higher ventilation rates. And that are better sanitized, because we are going to go in to do just what we're doing on this phone call, which is to hash out what's the next standard or what's the next, thermostat. So we need to be near each other. And so it's going to be an interesting and rapid shift in the way in which we use our buildings.
And I think creating visibility around the safety of the indoor air environment. Again, I'm a big proponent of using monitors to create visibility. I also think choices are important, and this is me. I don't think I'm alone in what I'm about to say, but I think for me, I would like to bring my dog to work, and I do bring my dog to work. And in the Environmental Health Committee, we wrote an emerging issue brief around ventilation for having a dog in your environment, nice, friendly, non-biting dog. I think those sorts of choices are valuable. And one thing that it's not a short term, it's not a visible effect, is the whole issue of the microbiome in the indoor environment and how that affects our health. And that definitely is improved by having your favorite dog with you. But I think choices and safety are key to having people want to go to work.
Actually, Stephanie, I know, Seema, I don't want to cut you off, just quickly on the microbiome. I actually do think that office owners and operators should start doing outdoor workspaces, giving people the option on every nice day to take a meeting outdoors, to take their calls outdoors, to take their laptop outdoors. So we really should start peeling away the whole idea of entering through a single door at 8:30 in the morning and leaving at 5:30 at night. And it's dark at both ends and you have no idea that it was snowed all day or whatever it is, all that totally insular design. I think we have to unravel that.
Seema, you want to get in?
I was just going to say that it's a hard moment for commercial real estate. I agree, offices are where this is interesting and challenging, because on the one hand, commercial office space is under siege. The reduced use means that industry is distracted by beautiful microbiome of Stephanie's dog, means that there's a sort of flight to cost saving. And at the same time, it also means that, this flight to quality, I think, is showing up in a lot of studies. There's a Cushman and Wakefield studies. There are others that show that, because of the reduced demand, that the spaces that there is demand for are the really good ones. And then those command the higher occupancies and higher rents. And so I think what I say to commercial real estate in the face of that is saying, ride the wave, don't try and fight it. It's here to stay. The trend is here to stay, and might as well get ahead of it, be proactive, and just avoid greenwashing. So anyone at this day and age can walk in with a $75 sensor to monitor. So avoid the temptation to do both, to have a flight to cost, away from cost and toward alleged quality. So just do it.
Good advice there. So we're just about out of time. I want to give each of our panelists a quick opportunity to share some final thoughts with us, particularly a theme again through all of your presentations has been the need for changes in building policies, maybe additional commitments of resources in the area of indoor environmental quality, particularly indoor air quality. And I'd like to hear each of your thoughts about how we accelerate the adoption of better policies and commit the resources necessary to achieve real and ongoing performance of quality indoor environments. And maybe I'll give it back to Seema, since you were waiting to get in.
Great. I'll just say 4 quick things in closing, which is one, I think we need stories, maybe even more than we need the ROI calculations. I think the business case is really important when it's a backup. And what I've seen really drive action is when there's leadership that is driven by values and vision and mission and something that comes before the ROI, especially in a cost tense market. I don't think the ROIs alone do the work, number one. I think we need to make it easy and automatic, which doesn't mean building automated, but automatic for people, automatic as part of their workflows. And it needs to be persuasive. The impact, if it's under debate, in the scientific community, that's a very different level of persuasion than when it's deeply established. And, I think there's a role for standards and regulations to sort of set the floor and for incentives and inspiration to sort of set the leading edge. So we need both of those.
Stephanie?
So I think, increasing incentives and decreasing obstacles to sort of be obvious. I think, like you said, Seema, making things easy, making things automatic, making things sort of almost like this is the best thing to do. This is the coolest thing to do. Everyone on Instagram is doing this. Is that an incentive? I think getting more medical professionals into this conversation. And if you have, if your primary care provider says you need to be in a building that has good indoor air quality, get insurance companies to cover some of this stuff. I know CMS is covering filtration in senior living communities, but expand that concept. And I think one of the biggest obstacles, at least in my conversations with customers or potential customers around making these metrics visible, is fear of litigation. Fear that, if your employee gets some illness or, health problem, they're going to say, you have the data that shows you had suboptimal indoor air quality, therefore you're liable. And I think that fear factor is huge. And I don't know how to protect quality, even quality control records. Because it seems like if it exists, it can be subpoenaed, but I don't know what to say about that.
Well, it's a good place to leave it. Vivian, I'll give you the last word.
Okay, just I'm not sure to do one more, but just quickly, I do think it's critical to expand the amount of research with the medical community. NIH, CDC, NSF should be really seed funding a lot of research on IEQ and human health and productivity. And making sure that the building community is actively engaged with the medical and health professions to doing that. I think we're going to need to invest in buildings, especially in areas that have been poorly invested in. I mean, there's the inequity in the built environment is still a very serious gap. And I think the IRA has done a lot to try to address some of the inequities, but it's very centric on carbon. And we need to sort of bundle that with IEQ. And then lastly, just to end where I start, we've got to celebrate nature and the climate that we're in, and re-engage people with the natural environment because it's key to our health.
Thank you, Vivian. I want to thank all of you. I also want to apologize to all the question senders that we didn't get to. We got a ton of questions and I tried to catch as many of them as we can. So thanks again to Stephanie, Vivian, and Seema for great presentations and for sharing their thoughts with us today. This session concludes day 2 of the Smart Buildings Exchange and the virtual component of the conference. Day 3 will be in person in Seattle beginning at 8 a.m. sharp. So thanks for attending the session and I'll give it over to Carrie.
Before you disappear, could you email the questions to us and then we could respond?
Carrie, are these captured somehow?
Oh, good question. I think there is a record of that, Stephanie. So I will take a look, and if it's possible, we'll follow up with you so that you can reach out to folks.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
Sure, yeah. So my name's Carrie. I'm the executive director from the Smart Building Center, and I messaged Chris in the middle here that I wanted to pop on and thank you all so much for lending us your time and your expertise. Sincerely appreciate it. It's been a really interesting panel to listen to. So thank you again. And as Chris said, this concludes our 2-day virtual programming. We will convene again tomorrow in person at 8 a.m. with refreshments and networking with formal remarks and panelists starting at 9 a.m. And for those who can't join us on site tomorrow, the recordings from tomorrow and from all of the sessions for the last 2 days will be available soon, and we'll be notifying all the registered attendees when we do get those posted. Thank you again to our sponsors, to our wonderful panelists and moderators, our speakers, and all those who have supported us in organizing this event. It's been really awesome coming together and listening to all of you. And I hope to see some of you tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in.
Thanks a lot, Carrie.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks,
you,
everybody.
Chris and Stephanie and Vivian.
Yeah, it's great. Super.
Pleasure.